The morning Amos Turner rode out toward the South Claim, 3 separate men in Caldwell, Kansas told him not to do it, and not one of them could give him a reason good enough to make him turn his horse around. It was the spring of 1878, and the prairie was just beginning to shake loose from winter's grip. The grasses along the flat stretches of Sumner County were coming up pale and tentative, and the sky carried that particular shade of blue that only showed itself in April, when the wind had not yet turned hot and the earth still smelled like promise. Caldwell sat right at the edge of the Kishom Trail, and it was the kind of town that had seen everything twice and forgotten most of it. A rough string of storefronts, a livery, a land office, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, and more men with unfinished stories than any one place had a right to hold. Amos Turner was 31 years old, broad through the shoulder, and wore his dark hair a little longer than was strictly fashionable, which his mother had always told him made him look like a man who was running from something. He was not running from anything. He had simply never found a reason to stop long enough to get a haircut. He had come to Caldwell the previous autumn after spending 4 years working cattle up from Texas, and he had filed on a quarter section of land north of town with every intention of building something permanent. He had a small herd, a good horse named Cobalt, and a solid reputation among the drovers who came through each season. He was, by most measures, a man with his feet on the ground. He was also, by most measures, a man who listened to his own instincts more than he listened to anybody else, which was how he ended up standing outside the land office on a Tuesday morning while Red Doyle leaned against the hitching post and told him about Lydia Mercer. "South Claim," Red Doyle said, pushing back the brim of his hat with one finger. Red was older than Amos by about 15 years and had worked ranches from Oklahoma Territory all the way up through Nebraska. He had earned his name from a beard that had long since gone more gray than red, and he had opinions about everything. The Mercer widow. She has been out there since her husband went down 2 winters ago, working that claim alone. Nobody who's gone out to help her has lasted. Pete Callahan lasted 6 weeks before he said the work was too hard, and she was too particular. Bill Finney lasted 3 weeks before he came back to town looking like he'd been wrung out and hung to dry. Frank Odom lasted 2 days. 2 days, Amos repeated. 2 days, Red confirmed with the gravity of a man reporting a battle casualty. She sent him home because he fixed a fence post wrong. Amos considered this. What was wrong with the post? Red looked at him the way a man looks at someone who has entirely missed the point. That's not what matters. What matters is that woman will outlast every man you know. She has outlasted a dozen already. She doesn't need help. She doesn't want help. She wants everything done exactly right, and she has no patience for anything less. You'll ride out there, she'll find something wrong with the way you hold a hammer, and you'll be back in town by Thursday. I'm not going out there to help her, Amos said. I'm going out there because the South Claim shares a fence line with the Harmon parcel that I've been meaning to purchase, and I need to see where the property boundaries actually fall. I might as well introduce myself. Red stared at him. You don't need to ride all the way out to the South Claim to look at fence lines. I do if the survey is as unclear as the land office says it is. Amos. Red. Red took his hat off entirely and held it in both hands, which was something he only did when he felt a conversation needed full emphasis. I have seen you do smarter things. That woman is not looking for a neighbor. She is not looking for company. She lost her husband to a fever that swept through here in the winter of '76, and she has been fighting for every inch of that land ever since. The men who hold the notes on the properties around her have been trying to push her out for 2 years. She is tough and she is sharp, and she is not going to be charmed by a tall cowboy on a blue roan. You hear me? Amos took his horse's reins from the post. I hear you fine, Red. I'm telling you for your own good. I appreciate it. He put his foot in the stirrup. I'll be back by the weekend. He rode south. The road that led toward the South Claim was more of a track than a road, twin-wheel ruts pressed into the earth by years of wagon traffic. the grass growing up between them in a pale green stripe that looked like a seam holding the world together. The land on either side was open and enormous, the way only Kansas could be enormous, with a sky that felt like it had been stretched out in every direction until there was no room left for anything modest. Amos rode at a steady pace, watching the horizon, letting Cobalt find his rhythm. He had heard about Lydia Mercer before Red brought her up that morning. In a town like Caldwell, stories moved faster than weather. He had heard that she was a widow who had refused every reasonable offer to sell her land and move back east to wherever she had come from. He had heard she was stubborn. He had heard she was capable. He had heard from a man named Tolliver who worked at the feed store that she had once repaired a collapsed barn roof by herself over the course of 4 days, because she could not afford to pay anyone and refused to ask for anything she could not repay. He had heard she had a daughter, 8 years old, named Clara, who went to the schoolroom in town 3 days a week and was, according to Mrs. Albright, who ran the schoolroom, one of the sharpest children she had ever taught. He had not heard that she was beautiful, but that was probably because none of the men who had been out there were the kind of men who would say so, at least not plainly. He came over a low rise and saw the claim spread out below him in the afternoon light, and he stopped Cobalt without meaning to, just taking it in. The house was small but solid, built from wood and stone, with a covered porch that ran across the front. A kitchen garden stretched out along the east side, already showing green rows of early plantings. The barn was in good shape, freshly whitewashed on the south-facing side. The fence lines were straight and clean and well kept, which was more than he could say for several of the larger operations he had ridden past on the way out. There were chickens in a yard to the west, a milk cow visible near the barn door, and a garden of what appeared to be fruit trees, young ones, not yet established but planted with clear intention, along the northern edge of the property. And standing in the middle of the yard, with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and a hammer in her right hand, was a woman who was clearly taking no notice of him whatsoever. She was working on the chicken coop fence, driving stakes into the ground with an economy of effort that suggested she had done it many times and intended to do it as efficiently as possible. Her dark hair was pulled back loosely, with several strands coming free in the afternoon wind. She wore a plain work dress, brown, with an apron over it that had seen considerable use. She was not a small woman, but she was not large either. She had the kind of build that suggested strength without advertising it, the kind that came from actual work rather than from any deliberate effort. Amos rode down the slope and through the gate that opened onto the main track leading to the house, and when he got to within 20 yards, she looked up. Her eyes were gray. He would notice that later. In that first moment, he mostly noticed that she looked at him the way a woman looks at a problem she has not yet decided how to solve. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, bringing Cobalt to a halt. "That's right." She set the hammer down on top of the fence post, but she did not come forward. "You're on private property." "Yes, ma'am. I'm Amos Turner. I filed on the Whitfield quarter section last fall, north of town. I've got business at the land office concerning the Harmon parcel, and since it shares a boundary with your land, I wanted to introduce myself and ask if I might walk the fence line on the south side of your property to get a sense of where the survey markers fall." She looked at him for a long moment. It was the kind of look that measured, and he got the impression that whatever she was measuring, she was not doing it imprecisely. "The Harmon parcel," she said. "That's right. Hal Harmon's been trying to sell that land for 2 years. The fence line on the south side of my property is exactly where it should be, and if anyone's been telling you it isn't, they're either mistaken or they've got a reason to want you to think otherwise." Amos kept his expression neutral. "I've seen the survey documents, and I think there may be a discrepancy between what was originally filed and how the markers were placed. I'm not suggesting your fence is wrong, ma'am. I'm suggesting the original survey might have been imprecise." She studied him another moment, then bent down to pick up the hammer again. "You can walk the south fence line. Don't move anything. Don't lean on anything I've recently repaired." "Yes, ma'am." "And when you're done, if you find anything that concerns you, you come tell me directly before you go to anyone in town." "That's a fair condition," he said. "It's not a condition," she said, already turning back to her work. "It's just how it's going to be." He tied Cobalt to the porch post and walked the south fence line, which took the better part of an hour. He had brought the survey documents folded in his coat pocket, and he walked them against the actual markers he found pressed into the earth small iron stakes that were supposed to have been placed by a surveyor in 1874. What he found was exactly what he had suspected. Two of the stakes were off by what appeared to be about 8 feet, which would mean the legal boundary of Lydia Mercer's southern property line was actually 8 feet further south than where her fence currently sat, which meant her fence was technically on land that would belong to the Harmon parcel if the original survey was taken as definitive. He stood at the southeast corner of the property for a while, thinking. 8 feet was not nothing. It was not a lot, but it was enough to matter if someone wanted to use it as a legal lever. And someone had been trying to push Lydia Mercer off this land for 2 years. He walked back to the house. She was still working on the chicken coop fence, with a focus that suggested she had not spent any of the last hour wondering what he was doing. "You were right," he said. She straightened and looked at him. "About which part?" "Your fence is exactly where you put it, but the survey markers are off. If anyone goes to the land office with the current markers and files a complaint about your fence line, they could argue you're encroaching on the Harmon parcel." Something moved through her expression, not quite fear, but something like the recognition of a threat that had been circling and had just shown its teeth. She set the hammer down again slowly. "How far off?" she asked. "About 8 feet on the southeast corner, maybe 6 on the southwest." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know that." "I don't think you were supposed to know it." Another silence, a longer one. She looked out over the south fence line with the expression of a woman doing rapid calculations that involved more than arithmetic. "Does Harmon know?" she asked. "I think Harmon knows exactly," Amos said. "And I think whoever advised him to hold onto that parcel rather than sell it 2 years ago knew as well." She turned her gray eyes to him then, and there was something in them that was harder to categorize than he expected, not suspicion exactly, and not gratitude exactly, but something in between, like she was deciding whether to trust the information without yet deciding whether to trust him. "What do you want for telling me this?" she asked. The directness of it surprised him, though it probably shouldn't have. "Nothing," he said. "I'm going to file to purchase the Harmon parcel anyway. If someone's been using a bad survey to set a trap for you, it's better to know about it before the trap springs. You came out here to buy that land." "I did. And if you buy it, you'll be my neighbor." "I would." She looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the loose strands of her hair and she didn't seem to notice it. "I've had enough trouble with neighbors," she said at last. "The Briggs family to the north let their cattle push through my fence 3 times last summer. I repaired it every time without saying anything, and the 4th time I sent Mr. Briggs a letter informing him that the next time I found his cattle on my land I would invoice him for the damage. He did not find it amusing." "I'd imagine not. Did he become a more considerate neighbor after that?" she said flatly. "Did he?" "He did, actually." The corner of her mouth moved very slightly. "Some people only understand one kind of language." Amos found himself smiling before he could decide whether to. "I'll fix the fence, Mrs. Mercer. The survey issue, I mean. I'll file a correction at the land office before I make any offer on the Harmon parcel. Get the markers placed where they should actually be." She looked at him carefully. "Why would you do that before purchasing the land? The corrected survey would make the Harmon parcel slightly smaller. It would be to your own disadvantage." "It's the right placement," he said simply. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then bent to pick up the hammer again. "I have a pot of coffee on the stove," she said, which was not precisely an invitation but was as close to one as he suspected she routinely offered. If you want to show me those survey documents, I'd like to understand exactly what you found." He followed her onto the porch and into the kitchen, which was clean and ordered in the way that small spaces become when the person who keeps them has learned to make every inch matter. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. A cast iron stove dominated one wall, with a pot of coffee on the back burner. The table was scrubbed wood with 4 chairs, and spread across one end of it were what appeared to be account ledgers, open to pages dense with careful handwriting. She pushed the ledgers aside to make room and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking how he took it, which he found oddly refreshing after years of people fussing over whether he wanted cream. He didn't want cream. He drank the coffee black and set the survey documents on the table between them, smoothing the creases flat with the heel of his hand. She bent over them and read them with the same focused precision she seemed to apply to everything, her finger moving along the lines of text, her expression neutral and intent. She asked 2 questions, both of them exactly the right questions about the reference point used for the original survey, and about whether there was a secondary document that corroborated the placement of the southeast marker, and when he answered both she nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had suspected. "My husband filed on this land in '72, she said, not looking up from the documents. "He was a careful man. He checked the survey himself before we built the fence." "I always thought it was right." "It is right," Amos said. "Your fence is right. It's the markers that somebody moved." She looked up at him then sharply. "Moved." "Those iron stakes don't drift on their own, Mrs. Mercer." The gray eyes went very still. "How long ago? Hard to say. The ground around them was disturbed, but it's been long enough for grass to grow back over it. Could be a year, could be 2. 2 years, she said quietly. Right after Thomas died. Thomas, her husband. Amos said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be useful. She straightened up and folded her hands on the table in a way that looked deliberate, like she was holding herself very steady. "Mr. Turner," she said, "if you file that survey correction and buy the Harmon parcel, you will make an enemy of a man named Dale Cruikshank, who holds the note on the Harmon land and who has been the one advising Hal Harmon to hold on to it. Cruikshank runs the largest land operation in this county, and he is not a man who appreciates opposition." "I know who Cruikshank is," Amos said. "Then you know what I mean." "I do." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I'm not particularly afraid of Dale Cruikshank." She watched him. "Most men are. Most men don't have anything Cruikshank wants." She was quiet for a moment, turning something over in her mind, and then she said with the careful neutrality of someone offering information without attaching sentiment to it, "He wants this land. He's wanted it since Thomas filed on it. The water rights come with it. There's a spring on the north edge of this property that feeds into a tributary of Bluff Creek, and in a dry year that water is worth more than the land itself. That's what this has always been about." Amos set his coffee down. He had not known about the spring. He filed that away without showing it. "Then you've been managing a water rights dispute while everyone in town thought it was just a stubborn widow refusing to sell a claim." "Most people see what they expect to see," she said evenly. He had no argument with that. The sound of boots on the porch preceded the front door opening, and the girl who came in was small and serious, and had her mother's gray eyes exactly. She stopped when she saw Amos, and looked at him with the unguarded assessment that children apply before they learn to hide it. "This is Mr. Turner," Lydia said. "He's a neighbor." "You don't have any neighbors," Clara said to her mother, but still looking at Amos. "I have one now, apparently," Lydia said. There was something dry in it, but not unkind. "I have a horse outside," Amos said to Clara. "His name is Cobalt. He likes apples if you've got any." Clara looked at her mother, who gave a small nod, and then she went back out the door without saying anything, which Amos counted as a reasonable beginning. He stayed for another hour, going over the survey documents in detail with Lydia, who took careful notes in a small book she produced from a shelf near the window. She was precise and methodical, and she asked questions that made it clear she had been thinking about the legal dimensions of her situation for a long time, even without having all the information. By the time he stood to leave, he had a clear sense of what needed to be done at the land office, and she had a clear sense of the same thing, which meant they were, practically speaking, aligned, whether either of them had intended to be. He walked out to find Clara on the porch steps, feeding Cobalt a piece of dried apple from her palm with the fearless confidence of a child who has grown up around livestock. Cobalt was behaving like a gentleman, which Amos appreciated. "He's very blue," Clara said about the horse without turning around. "That's why I named him Cobalt," Amos said. Clara considered this. "It's a good name." He untied the horse and stepped up into the saddle, and he looked back at the house for a moment before he turned north. Lydia had come out onto the porch and was standing with her arms folded, not quite looking at him, looking somewhere past him at the southern horizon with the expression of a woman who was already solving the next problem. He rode back to Caldwell with the spring wind at his back and the particular feeling of a man who has gone somewhere expecting one thing and come away with something else entirely, and who is not yet sure whether that is good or dangerous or both. Red Doyle was still at the saloon when Amos got back, and he looked up from his card game with the expression of a man who expected to have been proven right. "How'd it go?" Red asked. "Fine," Amos said, going to the bar. "She run you off?" "No," Red set down his cards. "You looked at the fence lines." "I did." "And," Amos accepted his glass from the bartender, "there's a problem. I'm going to fix it." Red stared at him. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that involves someone moving survey stakes to set up a legal encroachment claim against a widow who doesn't know her boundary markers have been tampered with." The card game had gone quiet. Two of the other men at the table were looking at Amos with carefully neutral expressions. "Cruikshank," one of them said very quietly. "That's a name I didn't say," Amos replied, equally quiet. Red picked his cards back up slowly. He looked at Amos for a long moment with something in his face that was not quite worry and not quite respect, but was somewhere between the two. "You be careful," he said finally. "That's all I'm telling you. I'm always careful." "No," Red said, "you're not. But that's between you and God." Amos spent the next 2 days at the land office with the survey documents. The land agent, a man named Harwick who was careful about his own position and thoroughly non-committal about anything that might involve him in conflict, was persuaded, after considerable time and the patient presentation of evidence, to open the original survey file and compare it against Amos's field measurements. The discrepancy was undeniable once it was laid out properly. Harwick agreed to request a resurvey, which would be conducted by the county surveyor within the following month, and he agreed, with somewhat less enthusiasm, to note in the official record that the current markers appeared to have been disturbed. Amos also put in a formal offer on the Harmon parcel, routed through the land office so that there would be a paper record of the date and amount. He heard about Cruikshank's reaction to this before 48 hours had passed, because Caldwell was the kind of town where a man's business was rarely private. Cruikshank was reportedly unhappy. Specifically, he had been heard to say, in the other saloon, the rougher one at the north end of the main street, that Amos Turner was a fool with too much time and too little sense, and that the South Claim situation would resolve itself without needing anyone from outside to complicate it. Amos filed away the word complicate and went about his business. He rode out to the South Claim again the following Friday, not because he had planned to, but because he was taking the long way around to check the western fence line of his own property, and the South Road was not significantly out of his way, which was at least partially a lie he told himself, and was mostly aware of telling. He found Lydia in the barn, working on the wheel of a wagon that had clearly thrown a spoke. She had the wheel off the axle and was examining it with a set of tools laid out on the barn floor in a precise row. "Mr. Turner," she said, without looking up. "Mrs. Mercer." He looked at the wheel. "You missing a spoke, too. The wood is dry cracked. I should have caught it in the fall." She did not sound distressed about it, just practical, the way she seemed to be practical about everything. "I'm going to town Monday," he said. I can pick up spoke blanks at the mill if you give me the measurements." She was quiet for a moment, and he got the sense she was deciding whether this was a favor she wanted to accept. He had begun to understand, in the short time since he had met her, that she was very careful about what she accepted from people. Not from pride exactly, but from the reasonable caution of a woman who had learned that most offers of help came with expectations attached. "The land office resurvey," she said instead. "Did Harwick agree?" "He did. The surveyor will come out within the month." She set down the tool she was holding and stood up, brushing sawdust from her apron. "And Harmon, did he accept your offer?" "Harmon sent back a counteroffer yesterday that was 20% above what I offered and also above what the land is worth. Somebody told him to hold out." "Cruikshank." "Most likely." Amos leaned against the barn door frame. "I sent a revised offer through the land office this morning. I also put it in writing that I intend to file for the survey correction regardless of whether the sale goes through, which means Harmon's sitting on a parcel whose value depends partly on a fraudulent boundary claim and whose fraudulence is about to be officially documented." She looked at him. "You're applying pressure." "I'm just making the information available." The corner of her mouth moved again, that almost smile. He was starting to look for it. "The spoke measurements are on a board above the workbench," she said. "I'll write them down for you." He came into the barn and she found a scrap of paper and a pencil and wrote down the measurements, and she handed them to him, and their fingers were briefly adjacent in the transaction, not quite touching, and he noticed this with the part of his mind that was paying attention to things he had told himself he was not paying attention to. "Coffee," she said, "if it's no trouble." "It's no trouble," she said, in the tone of a woman for whom very little was trouble in the sense of emotional inconvenience, though a great many things were trouble in the practical sense. "Clara is at school today. It's quiet." They had coffee at the kitchen table again, and this time the conversation moved differently, less purely practical, more exploratory. She asked him where he had come from before Caldwell, and he told her about the Texas cattle work, and the years before that in Missouri where he had grown up on his father's farm outside of Independence. He told her about the drought that had pushed his family to break up the farm and scatter, and how he had ended up driving cattle north partly out of need, and partly because it seemed like a way to see the country while figuring out what he was going to do with his life. She listened in the way that good listeners listen, with real attention rather than the polite performance of it, asking questions that showed she had heard what he said. She told him, in turn, that she was from Ohio, that she and Thomas Mercer had married in 1870, when she was 22 and he was 27, and had come west in 1872 following the wave of homestead claims that were transforming the Kansas plains. That Thomas had been a thoughtful man and a decent farmer and a good father to Clara, and that the fever that had taken him in the winter of 1876 had been quick and brutal, and had left her standing in the middle of a Kansas winter with a 6-year-old daughter and 80 acres of land and a clear choice between giving up and not giving up. "It wasn't really a choice," she said. "I knew I wasn't going back east. There was nothing to go back to. My parents were gone by then, and Thomas's family in Indiana were not people who would have made the situation comfortable. This is Clara's home. This is my home. I wasn't going to let someone take it because it was inconvenient for me to hold on to it." "How old are you now?" Amos asked, and then immediately recognized it as a question that sounded more blunt than he had intended. She raised an eyebrow. 30, she said. "Is that relevant?" "No," he said honestly. "I was just thinking that you've been managing this alone for 2 years and you're 30 years old, and you seem about 10 years more capable than most people I've met in my life." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at her coffee cup. "Thomas would have found that a peculiar compliment. I meant it as a real one." "I know," she said quietly. "That's what's peculiar about it." He rode back to his own property that afternoon with the feeling he had been carrying since the first visit, the feeling that had grown heavier and more specific. He thought about it honestly, which was something he tried to do with himself, because he had never found self-deception to be a particularly efficient use of energy. He was drawn to her. Not in the simple way a man is drawn to a woman by appearance alone, though she was certainly someone he found himself wanting to look at, but in the more complicated way that happened when a person showed you something true about themselves, and it turned out to be a thing you valued. She was 30 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years. She had a daughter and a claim she was fighting for, and no patience for nonsense. She had built something real on this land, and she was defending it with a clarity and toughness that he found, to his own surprise, something close to extraordinary. He was also honest enough with himself to acknowledge that she had given him no indication whatsoever that she regarded him as anything other than a useful neighbor and a man who was solving a problem that happened to align with her interests. He filed the spoke order on Monday. He brought the blanks out the following Wednesday. She came out of the kitchen when she heard him ride in, and she saw the spokes, and she said, "What do I owe you?" He told her the cost. She went inside and came back with exact change, which she put in his hand without making anything of it in either direction. He respected this, and did not try to wave it off, because he understood that her paying for what she received was not about money but about the terms of their relationship, and those terms were hers to set. He helped her fit the spokes, because the wagon wheel was a two-person job and she knew it, and they worked together in the barn with the easy practicality of people who are used to doing physical work and don't need to fill silence with conversation. Clara came home from school while they were working and sat on a hay bale watching them for a while with that serious gray-eyed assessment, and then she asked Amos whether Cobalt had ever won a race. "He's run in a few," Amos said. "He's faster than he looks." "He looks fast," Clara said. "Then maybe I should enter him in one of the spring races in town and we'll see." Clara appeared to find this a satisfactory answer and went inside to help her mother start supper. Amos stayed for supper. He had not been invited exactly, but there had been a point at which Lydia had said, while putting water on the stove, "We have enough if you want to eat before you ride back." And he had said yes with perhaps less deliberation than he should have employed. They ate at the kitchen table with Clara across from him, and the meal was simple and good corn bread and stewed chicken and early spring greens from the kitchen garden. And the conversation moved naturally among all three of them in a way that felt, to Amos, like something he had not known he was missing. He rode home in the early dark with the stars coming out over the flat Kansas horizon, and the warm light of the claim house visible behind him longer than made sense, because the land was so flat that you could see a lit window for a remarkable distance before it finally dropped below the curve of the earth. He started coming out twice a week. He told himself, for about a week, that it was because of the fence line situation and the pending survey and the business with the Harmon parcel. Then he stopped telling himself that because it was not true and he had a policy against lying to himself. The resurvey came in early May. The county surveyor, a quiet, methodical man named Greer, spent 2 days on the South Claim with his instruments and his assistant and his records. His report, filed at the land office the following week, confirmed what Amos had found. The markers had been moved. The original survey placed the boundary 8 feet south of the current markers, and Lydia Mercer's fence was correctly placed. The official record was amended accordingly. Harwick at the land office sent a formal notice to the holders of the Harmon parcel, advising them of the corrected boundary. 2 days after that, Harmon accepted Amos's original offer. Amos rode out to the South Claim to tell Lydia the same afternoon he got word. She was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, on her knees in the dirt thinning seedlings with a small tool that he could not have named but that she used with complete familiarity. She looked up when she heard Cobalt, and then, when she read something in his expression, she stood up, pulling off her gardening gloves. "The survey," she said, "filed and corrected, and Harmon accepted my offer." She stood very still for a moment, and something moved across her face that she did not quite manage to keep controlled relief, deep and genuine, the kind that comes out of a long tension finally released. It lasted only a few seconds before she had it back in hand, but he saw it. "Good," she said quietly. "The Harmon parcel goes to deed in 2 weeks. After that, the question of your south boundary is legally resolved and there's no argument left to make." She was quiet for a moment. "Cruikshank," she said, "what does this mean for him?" "It means his play for the water rights through the Harmon boundary is finished," Amos said. "He could still try to buy you out directly, but he's got no legal lever anymore." She nodded. "He'll try something else. Maybe. But whatever he tries, it'll be in the open." She looked at him steadily. "You've done more for this land than most people would have." "I own the land next door," he said. "It's in my interest." "It's more than that," she said, not letting him slide past it. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said honestly, "it's more than that." The silence between them was different from the comfortable working silences they had developed over the past weeks. It had weight. She was the one who moved first, which surprised him. She looked away, out over the kitchen garden, and said, "I'll put coffee on," and walked toward the house. He stood in the yard for a moment, Cobalt's reins in his hand, and then he tied the horse and followed her in. That afternoon they talked for 3 hours. Not about land or surveys or legal documents, but about things they had not yet talked about. The way the plains changed color through the seasons, and what Independence, Missouri, had been like in the years after the war, and what Ohio looked like in October, which she said was the thing she missed most about the East, and the thing she thought about every year when the Kansas autumn arrived and looked entirely different. She told him that Thomas had been the one who learned farming and that she had learned alongside him, and that some of what she knew had come from Thomas, and some of it she had figured out alone after he was gone, and she was not sure anymore which parts were which. "I think that's how it is when you've known someone a long time," Amos said. "You don't always know where one person's knowledge stops and the other's begins." She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one she wore when something surprised her into revealing more than she intended. "You talk about it as though you know," she said. "I had a woman I was going to marry," he said simply, "in Missouri, 10 years ago. She died of cholera before we could." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "I've been on the road since then mostly. It's a way of not staying still long enough to think about it too much." "Now you're filing on land," she said. "Staying still." "Trying to," he said. "Seems like it might be worth it." She looked down at her coffee cup and then up at him, and then she said with a carefulness that sounded like someone walking on uncertain ground, "I should tell you something. All right. I know what people in town say about me, about the men who have come out here to help, that I ran them off or worked them down or found fault with everything they did. I've heard some version of it," he said. "I did find fault with how Pete Callahan fixed a fence post," she said, "because he fixed it wrong and it would have fallen over in a month. I did ask Bill Finney to leave because he spent more time talking about how hard the work was than actually doing it. And Frank Odom I asked to leave after 2 days because he came out here with the idea that helping me with my land meant I would be grateful to him in ways I had no intention of being." Amos said nothing, but he held her gaze. "I'm not explaining myself," she said. "I want you to understand that I have made every decision I've made for a clear reason. I am not difficult to be around because I enjoy it. I am difficult to deceive, and some people find that the same thing." "They're not the same thing," Amos said. "No," she agreed. "They're not." He rode home that evening in the long Kansas dusk, with the sky going pink and then orange and then a deep, complicated purple over the western horizon, and he knew exactly how he felt about Lydia Mercer, and it was something that had been building for 6 weeks and had arrived at the point of being undeniable. He felt it the way you feel something that is true, not with the light giddiness of a passing attraction, but with the settled, serious weight of a thing that has roots. He also knew that she was not a woman you rushed, and he did not intend to. He came out every week through May and into June. He was doing real work on his own property, the first planting, the repair of the existing structures on the Whitfield quarter section, the process of moving his small herd from the leased pasture where they had been wintering onto his own land, and he was also, steadily, building the relationship between his property and the South Claim in practical ways that made sense given that they were neighboring landowners. They shared a fence line now. They had common interests where water and grazing were concerned. He consulted her on local knowledge about the land that she had accumulated in 6 years of working it, and she consulted him on the things he knew from years of working cattle at scale that she had no reason to have learned. And in between the practical things, they talked. And in the spaces between the talking, something else was building, patient and steady and impossible to miss if you were paying attention. He was paying attention. Clara Mercer, at 8 years old, was paying attention too, in the way that children pay attention to things adults think they are not noticing. She had started asking Amos, on his visits, about Cobalt's preferences and habits with the focused interest of a child who is collecting information for purposes she has not yet disclosed. She had also, on one occasion, asked him what he would name a horse if he had a second one, which seemed to Amos like a question that had a context he was not fully privy to. The Cruikshank situation did not resolve as quietly as Amos had hoped. In June, a man came to Amos's property and identified himself as representing a land company based in Wichita, which everyone in Sumner County understood to be one of the operations that Cruikshank moved money through when he wanted to do something at a distance. The man's name was Pratt, and he was well dressed in the way that men from Wichita were well dressed, with good boots and a manner that was supposed to communicate sophistication, but mostly communicated the careful performance of it. Pratt offered to buy Amos's property, the Whitfield Quarter section, and the newly acquired Harmon parcel, at a price that was above market. Amos told him he was not selling. Pratt mentioned, in the careful way that constituted a threat without being technically one, that the land market in this part of Kansas was subject to significant fluctuation, and that holding onto land that you had recently acquired at a time when larger operations were consolidating could prove to be more expensive than most individual landowners anticipated. Amos said he appreciated the information. Pratt left. 2 days later, Amos rode out to the South Claim and told Lydia about the visit. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. They were on the porch in the early evening, and Clara was inside reading, and the light was doing that particular thing it did on the Kansas plains in June, where it stayed golden for a long time before finally giving up. "He'll do something to the water," she said. "That's what he'll try next. The spring on the north edge of my property feeds down through your land before it hits the tributary. If he can disrupt the flow somewhere in between, or file some kind of claim on the downstream usage, he can make both our operations more expensive." "He'd need a legal mechanism," Amos said. "He has a lawyer in Wichita who has invented legal mechanisms before," she said. "The man who drafted the original bad survey was working for him. Somebody moved those stakes and it wasn't Hal Harmon." "I know," she looked at him. "I don't want you to be in this because of me," she said. "You came out here about a fence line and you ended up in the middle of a water rights dispute with the most powerful man in the county. That's not a fair situation." "I'm in it because the land is mine now and the water runs through it," he said. "That would be true regardless of you." "But you bought the land partly because of me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was just a thing she was saying plainly because she was a woman who said things plainly. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "partly." She held his gaze for a moment and then she looked out at the prairie horizon and she said very quietly, "Amos." It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I have been thinking about how to tell you this for several weeks, which means I should probably just say it." She did not look at him while she said it, kept her eyes on the horizon. "I think very highly of you. I think more highly of you than I have thought of anyone in a long time. And I am aware that you have been coming out here regularly and I have been letting you come, and I am aware of why, and I have been both grateful for it and frightened of it in about equal measure." The golden light lay across the porch and she was very still within it, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up in the way she held herself when she was making herself be brave. "Frightened," he said. "This land is everything I have," she said. "Clara is everything I have. The last time I let myself depend on someone, I lost him, and I nearly lost all of this with him. I am not a woman who does things without thinking them through." She paused. "But I have thought this through quite a lot, and I keep arriving at the same place." "What place is that?" he asked, and his voice was careful because the moment was careful. She turned and looked at him then, directly, in the way she looked at things she intended to see clearly. "The place where I'm glad you saddled your horse that morning," she said. He was quiet for a moment because the thing he felt was large enough that he wanted to be sure he said it right. "I was warned not to come out here," he said. "3 separate men told me you would outlast me. I think they were right that you'd outlast me. I think you'll outlast most things." He paused. "I saddled Cobalt anyway because I've been doing this long enough to know that the things worth doing are usually the ones someone else tells you not to bother with." She almost smiled, and it was the largest almost smile he had seen yet. "That is not a reassuring philosophy." "It's worked fairly well so far," he said. She turned fully toward him on the porch bench, and he turned toward her, and the golden light was going amber now, and she said, "I am not a quick woman. I don't do things quickly." "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I filed on a quarter section of land. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long time, and then she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them, and she did not say anything else, and neither did he, and that was enough. It was enough for a while. They moved slowly, which was right for both of them. He came out 3 times a week through the summer, and they worked side by side on the things that needed doing, fencing and planting, and the business of managing 2 adjacent properties with shared water interests. And in the evenings, they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked. And occasionally they rode together over the combined properties to look at the land and discuss what it could become if it was managed well and with clear purpose. Clara, who had been watching all of this with the quiet attention of a child who understands more than she is told, asked Amos in late July whether he was planning to stay in Kansas. "I am," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to feeding the chickens with the air of a person who has confirmed a piece of information they needed and can now move on. The Cruikshank situation escalated in August, though not in the way Lydia had predicted. Instead of a water rights filing, what arrived was a more direct approach. 2 of Cruikshank's men rode onto the South Claim property one Tuesday afternoon while Amos was there working on the north fence line. They said they were there to look at the spring. Lydia came out of the house, and Amos came up from the fence line, and the 2 men looked at both of them and had a brief and clearly unplanned reassessment of how the conversation was going to go. "The spring is on private property," Lydia said. "I don't know you and you don't have my permission to be here. Mr. Cruikshank has an interest in the water rights downstream," the larger of the 2 men said. "Mr. Cruikshank holds no documented interest in any water that originates on my land," Lydia said. "I suggest you tell him to discuss it through the land office, and I suggest you leave my property now." The men looked at Amos. "You heard her," Amos said, which was all that needed to be said. The men left. They did not come back, though Amos spent the following week satisfying himself that Cruikshank had not found another approach. He also rode into Caldwell and had a conversation with the county sheriff, a man named Dalton who was elected and therefore attentive to the opinions of the larger ranching operations, but was not, as far as Amos could tell, corrupt. He told Dalton about the survey stakes and about the visit to the South Claim, and Dalton listened carefully and said he would look into the survey matter, and that if there was evidence that the stakes had been deliberately moved by someone working for a larger operation, that was a criminal matter and would be treated accordingly. Whether that went anywhere, Amos was not certain, but Cruikshank's direct approaches to the South Claim stopped after that. The summer moved forward. Kansas in August was hot and flat and demanding, and the work of two adjacent land operations kept Amos and Lydia busy from early morning to late evening on most days. He had hired a part-time hand, a young man named Jerome who was 19 and steady, which freed up time to work the operations intelligently rather than just continuously. Lydia had resisted accepting anything she could not repay in kind, but they developed a working arrangement over the course of the summer that was honest. She contributed time to his operations when his planting needed extra hands, and he contributed time to hers when her repairs needed two people, and they kept a loose and informal accounting that both of them honored without making it the center of their relationship. On a Saturday evening in late August, Amos took Lydia to the summer social in Caldwell, which was held on the open ground behind the church and involved a fiddle player from out of county, a great deal of food that the town women had organized, and dancing that went until the stars were well out. This was observed by a significant portion of Caldwell's population, including Red Doyle, who watched Amos and Lydia dance to the second fiddle tune of the evening, with the expression of a man who has been proven wrong, and is deciding whether to find it annoying or satisfying, and is landing on satisfying. Lydia was a good dancer, which Amos had not expected, though he could not have said why not. She moved with the same economy and precision she brought to everything physical, and she was relaxed in a way he had not often seen her during the work of ordinary days, and she laughed at something the fiddle player said between songs, a real laugh, full-throated and unguarded, and Amos felt the thing in his chest that he had been careful about for months arrive with a completeness he could not argue with. He was in love with her. He had been in love with her for a while, but this was the moment the word attached itself with finality, standing on the trampled grass behind the Caldwell church with the stars coming out and the fiddle starting again. He told her so. Not that night. That night was not the right moment. It was too public and she would not want it said publicly. But on the following Tuesday, when they were sitting on the porch in the early evening and Clara was in bed and the night was warm and the fireflies were doing their slow floating light show over the kitchen garden, he said, "I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "All right." "I love you," he said. "That's not a proposition or a demand or a suggestion. It's just true, and I thought you should know it, because you're a person who deserves to have true things said plainly." She was quiet for a long moment. He watched her profile in the evening light, the way she held herself still when she was thinking hard. Then she said, "I know." He waited. "I've known for a while," she said. "I've been waiting for you to say it because I didn't want to be the first one to say it and have been wrong about what it was." "You weren't wrong," he said. "No," she agreed softly. "I wasn't." She paused. "I love you too, Amos." "I have been resisting saying so because it seems like a significant thing to say, and I don't say significant things casually." "I know you don't," he said, "and because I have a daughter, and any significant thing I say has implications that go beyond just me." "I know that too." She turned and looked at him directly. "Clara likes you." "I like Clara. She is not a child who likes people carelessly," Lydia said. "She gets it from me. She takes her time and she watches and she decides. She has decided about you." He felt this as something weightier and more important than the social currency it might have seemed. "I'm glad," he said quietly. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat together on the porch in the warm evening while the fireflies moved over the garden, and after a while she rested her head against his shoulder, very carefully, as if she were setting something precious down and wanted to be sure of the surface, and he put his arm around her, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. The autumn came in with wind and the smell of changing grass, and the particular quality of light that Lydia had told him she missed from Ohio. Only here it was different, broader, more exposed, with nothing to interrupt it. He had been thinking about the future in a specific way, the way that a man thinks about the future when he has stopped drifting and has something to stand on. He asked her in October. It was not a planned occasion in the elaborate sense. He had thought about it for weeks and had decided that elaborate occasions were not suited to who she was or who he was, and that the right time would be recognizable when it arrived. It arrived on an October afternoon when they were riding together across the combined properties, looking at the state of the south fence line before winter, with the sky that enormous Kansas blue and the grasses gone tawny and gold, and the air sharp with the smell of season turning. They had stopped at the top of a low rise where you could see both their properties laid out below, her claim with its solid house and kitchen garden and the whitewashed barn, and his quarter section to the south, with the new structures going up that he had been working on since summer. And she was looking out over it with the expression she sometimes had, the one that was partly assessment and partly something deeper. Something that had to do with the fact that this land was the thing she had held onto when everything else was gone. "Lydia," he said. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to take as long as you need to answer because I know you don't make significant decisions quickly and I don't want you to." She was very still on her horse, watching him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build something here with you, not take over what you have. It's yours and Clara's, and it should always be yours, but add to it. Work alongside you. Be here when things go wrong. Be here when they go right." He paused. "I want to be your husband, and I want to be someone Clara can rely on. And I want this land we're both standing on to be the beginning of something that lasts past both of us." She looked at him for a long time. In the way she looked at things, she intended to see clearly and completely before responding. The wind moved through the tawny grass around their horses, and the blue sky held everything. "Yes," she said. It was a single word, but it arrived with the same completeness as everything she said, with full intention behind it, nothing held back or qualified. He exhaled. He had not realized he had been holding his breath. She rode her horse alongside his and reached over and took his face in her gloved hands and kissed him, there on the October rise with the wind in the grass, and both their properties spread out below them like a map of the life they were going to make. They married in December in the Caldwell church, on a clear cold day when the sky was pale as ice and the ground was hard with early frost. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend McAllister, who had a round face and a warm manner, and who had known Lydia since she had first come to town as a widow and had, as he said to Amos privately before the ceremony, been praying someone decent would come along before she outworked the whole county single-handedly. The church was filled, which surprised Amos. He had not fully understood until that moment how many people had been watching from the edges of the situation. The drovers and the shopkeepers and the families who had known Lydia through 6 years on the South Claim, some of whom had helped her, and some of whom had simply admired from a distance, and some of whom, Red Doyle among them, had offered skeptical commentary that had proven entirely incorrect. Red Doyle sat in the third row and had the look of a man thoroughly at peace with having been wrong. Clara stood beside her mother during the ceremony, in a blue wool dress that Lydia had made for her from fabric she had ordered from Wichita, and she was very serious and very still in the way she was always very serious and very still. And when McAllister pronounced them married and Amos turned to Lydia, Clara reached over and took Amos's hand, and held it with the firm, decisive grip of a child who has made up her mind. The reception was held in the back room of the larger saloon, which had been cleaned and decorated by Mrs. Albright, and several other women of the town, with evergreen boughs and candles and long tables of food. The fiddle player from August had been engaged again, and he played through the afternoon and into the evening, and Amos danced with Lydia until his legs were tired and then sat beside her and watched the town dance around them with the feeling of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not fully know he was looking for. They had decided, practically, to keep both properties operating as they had been, at least for the winter, while they built the things that needed to be built. The most immediate project was expanding Lydia's house to accommodate the new reality of the household, a project that Amos and Jerome and 2 other hired men from town began in early January, adding 2 rooms to the north side of the existing structure and improving the kitchen, which Lydia had designed with an efficiency that made it clear she had been thinking about what a proper kitchen could look like for quite a long time. The winter was cold but manageable. They settled into the rhythms of shared life, which had already been half established through the months of working together and now became fully, openly themselves. He learned the things about her that you only learn from living alongside someone, that she was at her sharpest and most energetic in the early mornings, before the day had accumulated its demands, and that she had a habit of solving problems out loud to herself when she thought no one could hear her, and that she cried exactly once that winter, quietly, in the kitchen on a December evening that he eventually understood was the anniversary of Thomas's death, and that she did not want to be comforted exactly, but did want him to be there, which he was. He told her things about himself too, the things that are exchanged in the ordinary passage of nights and mornings and small conversations that accumulate into real knowledge. He told her about the nightmares he still sometimes had about the cattle drives, which were not about violence, but about the particular loneliness of long stretches of land with no one to come home to. He told her about his father, who had been a stubborn man with a good heart, and how he could see now, looking back, where he himself had inherited both qualities. He told her that the woman he had lost in Missouri had been named Grace, and that he thought about her sometimes the way you think about a road you did not take with sadness but without regret, because the road he had taken had led him here. Lydia listened to all of it in the way she listened to everything, fully and without judgment, and told him that she was glad he had told her, and that she thought Grace would have liked knowing he had found something worth staying for. Spring came again, and with it, the second planting season on the combined operations, which they were now beginning to discuss formally as a single enterprise. They had conversations with the Caldwell lawyer, a careful man named Price, about how to structure the ownership of both properties in a way that protected Lydia's original claim and Clara's inheritance, while also reflecting the reality of what they were building together. Price drafted documents that Lydia read 3 times and asked questions about twice, and then signed with the careful deliberation she brought to everything that mattered. Cruikshank, for his part, appeared to have accepted the situation. His man Pratt did not return. The attempts to leverage the Harmon boundary question were formally finished. There was word, in the spring of 1879, that Cruikshank was consolidating his operations in a different part of the county, which may or may not have been connected to a formal inquiry that Sheriff Dalton had apparently opened regarding the survey stake tampering. Amos did not know the details and did not go looking for them. The threat to the South claim was over, and that was what mattered. They planted 50 additional acres in corn that spring, using the combined labor of both properties and the water management system they had developed, which used the spring on the north edge of the claim to irrigate a portion of the fields in the driest part of the summer. The system was Lydia's design, worked out with diagrams she had drawn over the winter, based on something she had read in an agricultural publication from the Ohio State College, and adapted for Kansas conditions. It worked beautifully. Jerome, who had been working for Amos since the previous summer, proved to be a reliable and thoughtful young man who was interested in learning everything about land management. Amos hired him on full time in the spring of 1879 and gave him a small but fair stake in the operation, which Jerome accepted with a solemnity that suggested he understood the weight of it. Clara turned 9 in April of 1879 and received from Amos a young mare, gentle-tempered and gray, that he had been arranging since the previous autumn with a horse trader from Wichita. The name Clara chose for the mare was Silver, which was not a creative name but was chosen with such conviction that it became exactly right by the force of her certainty. Clara's relationship with Silver became the primary organizing principle of her after-school hours for the remainder of the year, and she showed, in her management of the horse, the same methodical seriousness that she applied to everything, which Lydia told Amos was the best outcome she could have hoped for. There were hard seasons, because there were always hard seasons in Kansas in the 1870s. A late frost in May of 1879 killed a portion of the early corn planting and they had to replant, which cost them 3 weeks and some of the margin they had planned for. A stretch of dry weather in July required them to push the irrigation system harder than they had intended, and they lost some yield, though not catastrophically. A market downturn in the late summer meant the cattle prices were lower than they had projected when Amos sold part of his herd in the fall. Through all of it, they managed. They managed because they were both people who had learned to work within reality rather than around it, and because they had a clarity with each other that made the management of difficult things straightforward even when it was not easy. They had that clarity in the ordinary way too, in the mornings at the kitchen table and the evenings on the porch, and the small, unremarkable hours of an ordinary life shared between two people who have decided to share it fully. He still looked for her almost smile and felt something warm in his chest every time he found it. She still said his name in that particular way, with a directness that meant she was about to say something she had thought about carefully, and he still paid full attention every time because whatever she was about to say was always worth hearing. In the autumn of 1879, Lydia told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, with the same directness she brought to everything, sitting across the table from him with her coffee in her hands and her gray eyes steady. He received it the same way, not with the performance of emotion but with the real thing, which arrived in his chest as something warm and large and slightly difficult to name. "When?" he asked. "Spring," she said. "Late spring, I think." "How do you feel?" "Like myself," she said, "which is either a good sign or it will catch up with me." It caught up with her somewhat in the second month, when the mornings became difficult in the way that they do. She managed this the way she managed everything, with practical acknowledgement and without dramatics, and it passed, and the winter unfolded with her steady and capable and increasingly interested in the practical logistics of expanding the household again. Clara, when she was told, received the information with the gravity of an eldest child, who understands that their position in the family is about to change, and who is processing this significant fact before deciding how to feel about it. She spent approximately 3 days being thoughtful and quiet, and then on the 4th day she announced at supper that she thought the new baby should have the larger of the 2 new rooms that Amos had added to the house, because the light in it was better in the morning, which would be important for a baby. "You'd be giving up the bigger room," Lydia said. "I know," Clara said. "My room is fine." Amos caught Lydia's eye across the table, and she gave him the smallest possible smile, private and full. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold in the way that Kansas winters could be truly cold, with storms rolling in off the plains that lasted for days and dropped enough snow to require sustained effort to keep the animals alive and the household running. They managed this, as they had managed everything, with organization and good preparation and the knowledge of people who have done it before. Jerome proved invaluable in the worst stretches, working alongside Amos with a cheerful competence that earned him Lydia's permanent approval, which was not given easily. By February, the worst was past, and the days began to lengthen, and the light changed in the way that signals the approaching end of winter, that particular quality of late afternoon light that falls golden across snow and makes everything look like a painting of itself. Amos was working on the north fence line one afternoon in March, with Jerome, when he stopped what he was doing and looked south across the combined properties toward the house that had been Lydia's claim house, and was now their house, solid and whitewashed with smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and the kitchen garden just beginning to show the first green suggestions of spring under the remnant snow. "Everything all right?" Jerome asked. "Yes," Amos said. He stood looking at the house for a moment longer. "Everything's exactly right. Jerome followed his gaze and grinned, the easy grin of a young man who understood exactly what was being said. "Good thing you didn't listen to Red Doyle," he said. Amos laughed, a genuine easy laugh, and picked up the fence tool again. "Good thing," he agreed. Their son was born in the last week of May 1880, on a morning that was warm and bright with early summer, with the kitchen garden in full early bloom and the sound of the first cicadas just beginning. The birth was handled by Mrs. Hammond, who served as the town's midwife, a steady woman who had brought half the children in Sumner County into the world and who had no patience for nervousness, in fathers or anyone else. Amos was on the porch for most of it, because Mrs. Hammond had made her position on fathers in the birthing room quite clear. He had Jerome keep him company for the first hour, and then sent Jerome to see to the animals because standing still was harder than moving. He walked the length of the porch approximately 30 times. He sat down twice and stood back up both times within a minute. When Mrs. Hammond came to the door and told him he could come in, he went in with his heart doing something complicated in his chest and found Lydia in the bed, tired and clear-eyed as ever, with a small bundled person in her arms who had dark hair and appeared to be asleep with the complete commitment of someone who has decided that sleep is the most important thing currently available. "Come and see your son," Lydia said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the small face, and then he looked at Lydia, and she was looking at him in the way she had looked at him on the October rise when she had said yes fully, with everything present, nothing held back. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like a person who just arrived and is still deciding how he feels about it," Amos said. She laughed, soft and tired. "What do you want to call him?" They had talked about names over the winter without fully settling. He looked at the small, sleeping face. "Thomas," he said, "if that's all right with you." Lydia was quiet for a moment, and something moved in her face that was complicated and deep and real. "It's more than all right," she said softly. Thomas Amos Turner was a solid, good-natured baby who appeared to have inherited his mother's precision and his father's patience in roughly equal measure. Clara took her role as older sister with a seriousness that matched everything else she did, and she was useful and attentive and only occasionally suffocating in her supervision, which Lydia said was exactly what she had expected. The summer of 1880 was a good one. The corn came in well, the cattle prices recovered to reasonable levels, and the irrigation system that Lydia had designed handled the July heat without failing. Jerome had become, by then, a full and trusted member of the operation, and he brought on a second young man in the late summer, a quiet Osage man named Henry who had come through from the territory to the south looking for steady work, and who turned out to have an extraordinary instinct for cattle and a quality of steadiness under pressure that matched anything Amos had seen in years of working with drovers. Amos was conscious of the injustice that Henry had to navigate, a man doing equal or better work than anyone around him, watched with suspicion by strangers who rode through the area, and sometimes by town people who knew nothing about him but the fact of his origin. He paid Henry the same as Jerome from the first day, and made it clear to anyone who had an opinion about Henry's presence on the operation that they were welcome to keep that opinion to themselves or take their business elsewhere. Most of them took it in the spirit intended. A few did not, and those conversations were short. Henry proved to be a man of considerable intelligence and quiet humor, and his friendship with Jerome, which developed over the first summer of working together, was one of those easy, genuine partnerships between people who recognize something compatible in each other. Lydia, who valued competence and directness above social convention, appreciated Henry immediately and without fanfare, which Amos thought was one of the things he loved most about her. The years settled into themselves with the weight and richness of things built to last. Caldwell grew around them, more settlers filing claims, the cattle trade intensifying as the years of the Kisham Trail reached their peak, the town acquiring new storefronts and a second church, and an actual school building in 1881, so that Mrs. Albright no longer had to share space with the Reverend McAllister. The South Claim and the Harmon parcel, operated together as the Turner operation, became one of the better-regarded small operations in the county. Not the largest, but consistently productive and run with a rigor and intelligence that people noticed. Red Doyle came out to the property one autumn afternoon in 1881, which was not something he often did, and sat on the porch with a cup of Lydia's coffee and looked out over the property with the expression of a man taking a thorough inventory. "You built something," he said finally, not to either of them particularly. "We built something," Lydia said. Red looked at her. He had been doubtful about her in the early days, not unkind but doubtful, the way people were doubtful about women who refused to fit the shape that had been prepared for them. He was not doubtful now, and she knew it, and she let him sit with the knowledge without making anything of it. "I told him not to come out here," Red said, nodding at Amos. "I know," Lydia said. "He told me." "Did he tell you I said you'd outlast every man he knew?" "He told me that too." Red looked at her and then at Amos and then back at the property. "I wasn't wrong," he said. "I was just wrong about what it meant." Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882, 2 years after Thomas, on another May morning with the kitchen garden in bloom. They named her Margaret, for Lydia's mother, and she came into the world with a full set of opinions about everything, expressed loudly from the first hour, which Mrs. Hammond said was a healthy indicator of character, and which Clara regarded with the cautious assessment of a 10-year-old who has already established a methodical working relationship with her younger brother, and is not entirely sure she wants to revise all of her procedures. Thomas, 2 years old and fascinated by everything that moved, was primarily interested in the new baby for approximately 4 minutes before discovering a beetle near the porch steps that claimed his full attention. Amos held Margaret that first afternoon with the same feeling he had held when he had first held Thomas, something large and warm and slightly beyond language, the feeling of a thing that you did not know you needed until it was in your arms. Lydia watched him from the bed, tired and clear-eyed, and she said, "You're going to be a man who spoils his children terribly." "I'm going to be a man who teaches his children to work hard and do things right," he said. "Those are not mutually exclusive." "I suppose they're not," she conceded. He looked up at her. She had her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and the afternoon light was coming through the window the way afternoon light in Kansas does, golden and enormous, and she was looking at him with that look. The complete one, the full one, the one he had first seen on the October rise 3 years ago and had seen 10,000 times since in the kitchen and on the porch and across the supper table, and in the quiet mornings when the house was still and they were the only ones awake. He was exactly where he wanted to be. "I was warned," he said, to no one in particular. She raised an eyebrow. "That you'd outlast every man I knew," he said. "That you were impossible to help and impossible to charm, and that I'd be back in town by Thursday." She looked at him steadily. And I saddled my horse anyway." "You did," she agreed, and the corner of her mouth moved into the smile that was no longer almost, the full, warm, real smile that she had stopped hiding somewhere in the first summer of their marriage, that came out now whenever she was not fighting it. "It was a good decision." "The best I ever made," he said. Margaret made a sound in his arms, a small and vigorous protest at being still for too long, and he looked down at her, and she looked up at him with the unfocused but emphatic gaze of a person who has just arrived and intends to be fully present in the situation. He laughed, and from the door Clara appeared to report that Thomas had eaten the beetle and was apparently fine, which required immediate parental consultation, and the afternoon dissolved into the ordinary extraordinary business of a full life, fully lived on a piece of Kansas ground that a woman had held onto through grief and hardship, and 2 years of fighting, and one April morning, when a tall cowboy on a blue roan horse had ridden down from the North Rise and asked if he could walk the fence line. The spring of 1883 brought a good rains and a good planting, and by summer the Turner operation was running at the best capacity it had ever achieved. Jerome had his own small claim by then, filed the previous year on a stretch of land to the east, though he still worked part-time with Amos and considered the south claim a second home in all the ways that mattered. Henry had built himself a solid dugout on the northwest corner of the property and lived there through the working seasons, managing the cattle end of the operation with a competence that Amos trusted completely. Caldwell was changing, as everything in that part of Kansas was changing. The cattle trade was shifting, the open range giving way to fenced land, the wild seasons of the trail drives beginning to give way to a different kind of West, less dramatic, more settled, more divided between those who had managed to put roots down and those who had not. Amos watched it with the eyes of a man who had been on both sides of that line, and he was grateful, with a completeness and specificity that he had not been capable of in the years before, for the side he was on. Clara was 11 in the spring of 1883, and had become, by that age, a person of formidable capability and independent thought who could manage the kitchen garden alone, ride silver over the full extent of the property checking fence lines, and calculate the seed requirements for the following season's planting in her head faster than most adults could do it on paper. She was going to be extraordinary, and not in the way that parents say it about children out of love rather than accuracy, but in the actual observable sense of a person who is already demonstrating the shape of what they will become. Lydia watched her oldest child sometimes with an expression that Amos recognized, the same expression Lydia had worn when she first looked at him, the measuring one, the one that was taking stock of something real. "She's going to be tougher than both of us," Amos said one evening, watching Clara explain something about soil drainage to Jerome with the clarity and confidence of a person who has thought the thing through and knows what she knows. "Yes," Lydia said with complete satisfaction. "She is." The land held. The spring on the north edge kept running, clear and cold through the dry summers, and the water rights were properly documented at the county level and had never been seriously challenged again. The house that Lydia had built with Thomas in 1872 stood at the center of something that was larger and more rooted than it had been. With the additions Amos had built, and the new barn they had raised together in 1881, and the established fruit trees along the northern edge that were now giving real harvest apples and pears, not big yields but good ones. And Lydia made preserves every fall from them that she put up in jars on the kitchen shelves, and that lasted through the winter as proof that something planted with patience and intention would eventually give back more than it had taken. On an October evening in 1883, 5 years after the first evening they had sat on this porch together and she had taken his hand, Amos and Lydia sat in the same place and watched the same kind of sunset, the October light going amber over the Kansas plains, the grasses tawny and the sky enormous. Thomas was inside, 3 years old and thoroughly asleep, having spent the day in the exhausting way that 3-year-olds spend their days. Margaret was 18 months old and asleep in the room with the good morning light, the room Clara had given up, and from the faint sound of small, regular breathing audible through the open window, she was sleeping the sleep of a person who has no concerns. Clara was on the steps with a book, reading in the last light as she did every evening until it was too dark to see. "October," Lydia said. "October," Amos agreed. "I still think about Ohio in October sometimes," she said, "but it doesn't make me sad anymore." He looked at her. "What does it make you?" She considered this in her precise and honest way. "Grateful," she said, "for having had it, for having something that was worth missing, and for having this." She gestured, a small gesture that somehow encompassed all of it, the land and the house and the children and the evening and him beside her. "Both, both," he said. She leaned against him the way she had leaned against him that first real evening, the June night with the fireflies, settling against his shoulder with the trust of a woman who has tested the surface and knows it will hold. He put his arm around her and felt the specific and irreplaceable weight of her against his side. Clara looked up from her book at the fading light, and then at her parents, and then she went back to her book with the small, satisfied expression of a child who has looked at her life and found it good. The stars came out over the Kansas plain, one by one and then all at once, the way they do in that enormous sky where there is nothing to interrupt them, and they spread from horizon to horizon in their impossible abundance. And the South Claim sat beneath them, solid and lit and firmly, undeniably, permanently home.